Hello, and welcome to Mastering Risk-Free Rollouts, the role of automated guardrails and release verification and progressive delivery. Today's webinar is sponsored by Harness and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech, and I am excited to be your moderator for this especially timely presentation. Now, before we get to today's great content, we have a few housekeeping items that are going to help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. So not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues. But if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several great resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to a couple of those from Harness. There's a blog post on 5 steps to instant feature impact detection and another blog post about instant feature impact detection for web page performance through Split Suite. So I encourage you to access those resources now and feel free to share them with your friends and colleagues. Now, third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the link with the details there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. So after the event is over, the ATM team will look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. Okay, with all that housekeeping out of the way, let's get to today's fantastic session. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Evie Shaw, who's Senior Manager in Engineering at Harness, and we have Annie McDowell, who's Director of Product Management at Harness also. Evie, Annie, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you, Evie, to get us started.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming in and listening to our talk today. Hopefully, you'll find it valuable. So let's just kind of get right into it. I'm going to assume that if you are an engineering manager right now, you're part of an engineering team, you are getting asked to do more with less. This is something that I think engineering teams always end up in this kind of situation, but even more so now when you have technologies like AI coming in that your companies want to start to implement. When you look at the economy as it is today and the layoffs and things like that, there is even more pressure now to be doing more with possibly less or the same amount of resources that you had before all of this. And so when you're getting asked to release more frequently, to put more things out there, the burden of that falls onto yourselves, your engineering teams, your product managers. All of those folks are the ones who are bearing that weight. And how do you do that? How do you innovate faster without breaking things? How do you look at your team and make sure that they're not overstressed, that they're able to manage burnout, that they feel productive and feel valued? And here are some ways that we've kind of worked through to help combat those things. Okay, so just to start off, feature flags in general, right? Like feature flags are one way that you can definitely help to do this. It is much easier to be able to go and turn off a feature flag than it is to do a full rollback. So if you're in that kind of production war room environment, you've been called in for an incident, there's a lot of stuff going on, you have customers kind of coming down, you're getting a lot of pressure. The ability to have a feature flag that you can just go in and try turning it off is much more safety. Now, that being said, it's not everything, right? Like say you're in a situation where you're using multiple feature flags. You have 4 or 5 features rolling out at the same time. You're not monitoring anything necessarily between those features. It can be very difficult to understand which feature flag is actually the one causing the issue, or maybe it's none of them at all. So even when you're doing these kinds of things, a feature flag by itself is not enough. You really have to start to think about how do we move away from just all or nothing releases and actually finding ways to make our release management more powerful, easier on our engineers, and just more safe in general. And so what we do is really try to practice this idea of a do no harm release. And this is something that we found there are a couple of best practices that really impact being able to do this. And those are progressive rollouts, knowing what to measure, and then also feature level observability, which really kind of takes in the combination of those two things to make that the most powerful. And this is an area where this is really what can help you balance that equation of speed, wanting to release things out faster, but also managing your risk and making sure that your risks are safe, you're causing less problems for your customers, anything of that nature. Being able to adopt this kind of a mindset with your engineers, with your product managers, with your team can be really powerful and just putting your team in a better place for releases. And so we're going to go into each of these best practices. All right. So the first one is progressive rollouts. This is one that you may have heard of before. The classic way to push something out, right, is you put it into production, you merge it in the queue, it gets out there, the code is there. Amazing. The world has changed. Your code is out there, people are walking around using it. It's a very powerful feeling, right? And it's what I would really say as engineers, that's why, people love the job. Like you're able to do something and you're able to put it out and actually really change the way something works. And people are using your code day to day. Now, that is very powerful, but it can also have its own drawbacks, right? Like worst case scenario, you push something out and then something starts to go wrong. You start to get all these alerts, you're getting paged on things. There's an outage, you're getting pulled into a war room along with a bunch of other people. Everyone's trying to figure out what's happening. Everyone's trying to figure out who caused the problem unintentionally. All of those things are happening. And while that is going on, all of your users, 100% of them, because you rolled it out completely, is being impacted by this error. So it takes a lot of time to figure out sometimes what happened in a release. And during that time, there is a lot of possibility of doing harm that could be happening to your customers. And so that's what progressive rollouts can help you try to avoid. It does take a little bit longer in terms of going through the whole rollout cycle, but it can be a really useful way to make your rollouts and your releases more safe, as well as to kind of try it out in a more receptive audience. And progressive delivery can take a lot of different forms. There's no one must-have way of doing this. You can adjust it to what makes sense for your organization and for your team. A couple of examples of this. One easy way to start is to start by just turning it on for your internal team. This is something that we do a lot, where we turn it on just for our company, where we put an announcement in Slack, people try it out, they let us know what they're seeing, they let us know any bugs. Much, much easier to work through those things in your internal team than getting something externally. You can also do an early adopter push first. So this is where having your PM be bought into this strategy and working on this with you can be really powerful. Your product manager can go talk to customers and identify an early group of hand raisers that say, hey, we're really excited about this feature. We want to be the first ones to test it out. We know there might be some issues or small bugs with it, but we just want to try it. We're just really happy to see this coming down the road. And doing that can be really great because you can get some early customer feedback. You have a customer group that is already primed about your feature. And that also knows that hey, since this is an early kind of preview of a release, there might be some bugs and there's not as much pressure in your realm on your team in that kind of a release. And then there's also the classic kind of canary release. So this is when you start with a smaller percentage, maybe 5%, 10%, and then you slowly start to ratchet it up, 20%, 50%, 70%, whatever makes sense for your organization. And what's even more powerful in that kind of a staged release is really if you're monitoring in between each of those steps, what is happening so that you can figure out what the right call is to move forward. And so even though progressive rollouts can feel a little bit slower when you first get started with them, it's actually saving you a lot of potential time of backloaded issues, of just kind of anxiety, of like putting everything out there all at once and possibly running into bigger issues, and just a great risk reduction tool in general. It's much, much easier and it feels a lot better to catch a critical bug in these early stages of rolling out versus your biggest customer getting hit with it because you went 100% right away. And so you're really just making your release more stable and secure by using progressive rollouts. And then we started to touch a little bit on this, right? So even by itself, progressive rollouts can be very powerful, not having to go immediately to that 100. But one of the questions that comes up often when someone tries it is, how do I know when to jump to the next stage? If I'm going from 20% to 50%, how do I decide when is the right moment to go to that next step? And that can feel sometimes like a very arbitrary decision. And so this is where it's really powerful to also think about what you might want to measure in each of your steps. And actually measuring these things can give you some data points so that it doesn't feel so arbitrary to make a call to go to something to the next stage. But it can also make your releases faster because now you know what you're watching for. You can have more confidence in those things and actually feel like you're making an educated choice about when to start shifting to the next phases. And we all know for engineering teams, it can be very difficult to get the right telemetry and measurement baked into a release at the very beginning. It's something that's easily forgotten in product specs. You're just kind of focused on building the features. And then maybe when you're almost about to release, you're putting in some basic monitoring, something that your organization has some standard things that you look for, things like that. But it's very easy for you to put out the release and then see like, hey, your alerts and your monitors, they actually need to be tuned. Or your customers may be using it in different ways that you didn't realize, and you have gaps in what you're actually monitoring. And what that ultimately means is that it's not uncommon for development teams to release features with a pretty limited or narrow kind of niche of monitoring when they first start out. I would say that is probably the case in most situations versus having very robust monitoring right away. And so it can feel faster to just kind of push a feature out, right? With some basics on there. You maybe do a bug bash, you try to catch the most critical things, and then you hope, right, that things have worked out. You try to do some testing, but something might happen. Like we all know that sometimes even if you try to do the right things and you try to put all the testing in place, sometimes things are just unexpected. And the worst case scenario, right, is when a customer is the first person to report an issue. So when the first time you realize something is going wrong is a support ticket, it's a bug report, that always feels very rough. And that also brings in doubt for your team. If you kind of see that first from your customers instead of catching it yourself, it really leads the team to question, well, do we know what the state of our services are? Do we know what's happening in our technical stack? It's not a good place, essentially, for your engineering team to be feeling like. And so it's really worth the time to think about in your releases, what kinds of things do you want to measure ahead of time so that you can put yourself in a better position. And so the list that you see on the screen is kind of a non-exhaustive, simple checkpoint to get started in having this conversation with your team. This is something that we've put together ourselves in our practice, that we've talked to our customers and kind of worked with them through on this. And each organization is different. So it'll look a little bit different for your product and your needs, but it's a great starting point for these conversations. And so that first metric, performance metrics, these are probably what your engineering team is familiar with already. You probably are already measuring some kind of performance. You have latency monitors, things like that. That is an easy one to go ahead and make sure is in place. And then you get to user experience metrics. These are a little bit different, and this starts to kind of roll into some of the product sensibilities beyond just kind of the performance side. So it's not just kind of latency of your infrastructure, things like that, but what your users are actually experiencing. So these can be things like run metrics, load time, error rates, things like that. And just starts to kind of have these conversations with your product manager on the types of things that you want to be looking towards here. And then the next jump from there is business metrics. This is interesting because I think it's easy sometimes as an engineering team to say, you know, business metrics aren't what our team necessarily monitors or looks at too closely. Like that's something that a BI analyst is looking at, or a product manager, or some other teammate somewhere else in the organization is looking at. It's not something we need to care too much about. Um, and unfortunately, that often ends up being a little bit of a trap. Because the bottom line is someone else in your organization does care about these kind of metrics, and they're watching these kind of metrics. And if your product is impacting this without you realizing, you're going to get called out on this. And that is another very stressful situation, right? If you have an executive or someone else going to your team and saying, hey, I saw like this metric is like not doing well, something is happening here, like you have to fix it, you have to figure it out, and it becomes this fire drill for your team. And that's not a good situation to be in either. So this is definitely also something that it's worth having that cross-functional conversation to see if there are certain business metrics that your team already knows about, your stakeholders already know about, that you can go ahead and implement and watch for in your release, just to make sure that you're being proactive about it. And then the last couple questions here on the screen, these are also conversation starters for that discussion with those stakeholders. The first one is pretty straightforward, like what metrics do you want to optimize for? This is something that your product manager has probably already thought about. Oftentimes when we start projects, we have to give a justification, right, for like what needle you're trying to move with those projects. You likely have a good sense of what this might be already. The other question is the one that we don't always ask. This, what metrics are important to protect against for negative impact? There's usually this kind of blanket assumption that, just don't break anything, don't make anything worse. But that kind of a general statement is not very useful in terms of what you can actually watch for and measure for. So actually having a conversation to see, like, are there certain things that your company, your product team, you guys really care about, that you want to make sure that you're just kind of keeping an eye on in general? That's also an important one to make sure that you have that first conversation. And again, a lot of this kind of gets into stakeholder conversations with your PMs, with business stakeholders, BI folks. It's a really great way of your team also building out that kind of business acumen and starting to bring in that business strategy and working in that partnership. And then once you have these metrics identified, you can go ahead and get your alerts, your monitors, all of those things that you're already familiar with, those kinds of things set up. All right. So those are the first two, right? The progressive rollouts, the knowing what to measure. The piece that really brings those things together and can make it the most powerful is what we call feature level observability. And the way to maybe start to think about this is to first look at traditional observability. All right, so say you have a traditional observability system, you have your APM tools. This is probably the kind of chart that you're used to looking at. It's this kind of aggregated view, right, of a lot of different parts of your system. And I would bet that your engineering team probably has a ton of different monitors where you're looking at dozens of charts that look like this. You're probably jumping between different applications that all have charts that look like this. And it is a lot of noise, essentially, to have to piece through. And then say something goes wrong, you see like one of the charts start to look like they have issues, you have to click into it, you often have to open up other charts. And then you might have a ton of other factors on top of that as well. You might have to look at, which version are you looking at, which environment, which region are you in? There's so many different factors that can make going through this kind of observability model very difficult, very noise heavy, and very messy to kind of work through. And so what's powerful instead about feature level observability is that it can give you more insight and help you cut through some of that noise. So for example, here, that kind of the gray black screen that you see in the middle, that's what something might look like traditionally. Maybe you see in one of your charts, 2% of your users are seeing some kind of an error. 2%, depending on your product, maybe that is an acceptable margin of error. It's hard to tell exactly what is happening there, if it's a blip of something, if it actually is something more systematic. It would be very reasonable if you're doing a rollout to say, okay, I'm at 10%. I see 2% of users have issues. Doesn't really seem to be caused by any particular thing. I'm going to go ahead and just continue my rollout. And you just kind of keep going. But in this kind of a situation, if you were able to have feature level observability, you might be able to see something more like what you see on the right there, where you can actually see this user base is not just a homogeneous group, right? Like you have people looking at multiple different users and then different versions on each of those things. And then when you look at that view, you can actually see, well, 2% of users in that whole group is actually 40% of users looking at a specific version of feature 2. And that suddenly is a very different data point, right? Like you now have something that you can say, oh, that's actually a pretty serious error rate. And I need to go dig into that and figure out what is going on there. And so that's the power of looking at these things at the feature level and having that level of observability rather than just a generalized view. This is something that we hear a lot from our customers, that sometimes if they're looking at the traditional view, they might be almost all the way through a rollout before they can actually tell that there's a problem. And so you've reduced some risk, but you weren't able to catch it early enough. And actually looking at the feature side is what helps you really understand that there might be something going wrong faster and being able to look at that earlier. This is another visual, very similar kind of thing, right? Like you have your aggregated chart, you see the ups and downs, not clear if something is a blip. There's nothing that dramatically says like something is going off here. But then underneath this chart, this could be getting data from 5 different features with multiple versions on each of those features. It's very difficult for me to say, as an engineering manager, if I look at this, I'm not going to ask someone on my team to go dig into any of these. Like, there's not enough data for me to say, like, yes, spend your valuable time by looking at all of these different features. It looks like it's okay. Now, imagine instead, though, that you get a view and a data points that are something more like this. Like you have your overall chart, but then for each feature and for each version of that feature, you can actually see that some of them are causing positive effects on some of the metrics that you're looking at, and some of them are causing negative effects. This is much more useful for me to be able to tell my team, like, hey, something is going on in these versions. We should be looking into this. Or even if I'm looking at my rollout, right, I can now see feature 1 there's version A, which is having a positive effect, and then version B, which is having a negative effect. That's a pretty easy indicator to me then that I should go ahead and continue my rollout with version A instead of version B. So again, being able to to feel like you have more data, to have more insight, and being able to manage your releases and rollouts is very powerful in this way. So just to kind of summarize those best practices, right? Each of these things, again, will help you. If you do just progressive delivery from going to on and off, if you're measuring things, even if you don't do progressive delivery, all of that are still steps that bring you some degree of safety. But it's really the combination of all of these things and then having also that feature level observability on top of it that really puts your team in a position that you can release more. You can have less risk. You can find issues earlier. You can make an educated guess faster on your releases. And it's just a much more powerful tool for your engineers and your team to feel like that they have something backing them up and they're not looking at kind of intense rollbacks and those kind of stressful situations. So again, these are best practices and you can apply these practices in any of the tools that you might be using today. But what's really great about Harness is that we already have some products that you can get some of these things built in right out of the gate. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it to my colleague, Annie, who will tell you about some of these products.
Thanks, Evie. So as Evie mentioned, Harness has many products, and split feature management and experimentation is one of Harness's products that can help you implement these best practices and achieve risk-free rollouts. And we do this with a capability that we call instant feature impact detection. And instant feature impact detection pairs your feature flags with all the data that you care about, whether that's performance, behavioral, business data, or others. So from errors to conversion rates, Split FME will automatically measure the impact of all your new features and rollouts on those metrics, so we can quickly identify issues and notify you about them with precision and speed, ultimately reducing the manual effort that you have to go through of detecting, triaging, and resolving any issues. So as Evie kind of talked through, not even APM tools can detect impact the way you need to automatically to get to that feature level observability in the way that Split FME can. And that gives you the certainty to decide if you want to continue your rollout on the path to getting to 100% of your intended audience, or if you really need to take a pause and roll things back. So how does that actually work? Instant feature impact detection seamlessly extends your progressive rollout to provide you with ongoing release verification. So as you're gradually rolling out new features, Split FME is watching every metric, again, for every progressive rollout, and measuring your new experience against your previous experience. So we have kind of eyes on everything. And all of that measurement is powered by our experimentation engine and advanced statistics. So if there is a significant difference between old and new, whether that's a good difference or a bad difference, we will catch it and we will let you know about it. And the big difference between other solutions is that we can do that really early in your rollout. So as low as 1%, 2%, 5% before an issue is being experienced by most or all of your customer base. So there are 5 core components or steps to getting the benefit of instant feature impact detection within the Harness platform. So first, you need to create an active feature flag. And if you're already familiar with or using feature toggles or feature flags today, you're doing this already. There's no real change there. Step 2 would then be to send the event data that you care about so that Split FME can tie all of that rich event and metric data to the feature flags via our attribution engine. Step 3 is then to create those metrics. So you can let us know what you want to be measured and how you want it to be measured without changing how your data pipelines are set up and a lot of that underlying code or process. And then step 4 is to implement the progressive delivery best practice that Evie talked about earlier. So Split FME can provide that automated protection. And then finally, step 5 is really understanding impact. So that's where Split FME will send you alerts and provide you with analytics via our dashboards so you can take quick informed action on your rollouts. So our team at Harness has been focused on making these 5 steps even easier to implement within our platform by automating many of these components for you. So now we're going to walk through some of the capabilities that showcase how you can get started with instant feature impact detection with very minimal setup and really start benefiting from automated release verification so you can get to those true risk-free rollouts. So the first one we'll talk about is around making data collection really easy. So we've released something called the Split Suite, which is an integrated way to install our SDK and RUM agents. Once installed, Split FME will auto capture feature flag impressions and all of the key performance metrics like page load time, errors, and web and mobile vitals. Now, once that data is flowing into Split FME, we'll actually auto-create the metrics for you so that you're prepared to see that impact as soon as you start rolling out any new features that you have going on. So you can see that we've actually taken care of the first 3 steps for you with one action required on your end. All you need to do is install the Split Suite. Now, as Evie talked through earlier, it can be really challenging for teams to understand what's important to measure, especially as teams and organizations get larger and larger. But it's a lot easier if you can define that everyone knows what's important. And that's where guardrail metrics come in. So your organization can assign its most important metrics and KPIs to this new metric category called guardrails so that every developer, every product manager knows what is top of mind to protect for every feature rollout. And you just have to do this once. So as soon as a metric is assigned as a guardrail metric, it will be monitored automatically for every progressive rollout and protected with other capabilities like alerting. So at this point, all you have to do again is progressively roll out your features, and Split FME will handle the rest for you. If and when we detect that a feature that you're rolling out caused a degradation or even a positive impact on any of the metrics that you care about, we will automatically notify you so you can quickly take action and give you again the dashboards and analytics for you to dive deeper and understand more what might be the problem. All right, now let's tie all of that together and take a look at how IFID works in action. So in this example, Christina is an engineer on her company's growth team. And the company's been noticing that users are abandoning their onboarding flow, but then they're getting stuck with basic capabilities and features later on. And this is really slowing down and adding friction to adoption of their product. And this is a problem that's top of mind for their R&D teams and support teams that they really want to resolve. So Christina's team has been tasked with a goal to increase the onboarding completion rate. And to accomplish this, they have been working on a new and improved onboarding flow with kind of like a refreshed UX that's a little bit more interactive that they're hoping will really boost this completion rate. So they start progressively rolling out the new feature. And at around 20% of users with access to the new onboarding flow, Christina receives a feature impact alert from Split FME. And she takes a look at her results, which you can see here on the right, and notices that her results are actually a little bit mixed. So they're definitely seeing improvement in that metric that they care about and that they had a goal set around. But she also sees that the feature is causing an unexpected degradation in errors. And when she checks her APM tool, the team's able to see that errors still look flat. It's a view that's very similar to what Evie was showing on a previous slide. And it's because they're still so early in the rollout that the problem isn't big enough yet that it will show up meaningfully in their APM tool. So it still looks like it's just a blip there. And Christine is pretty confident with this data that if they continue to roll out this new onboarding flow, it's going to become a bigger problem, potentially an escalation, and she really wants to avoid that. So at that point, Christina and the team decide to take action and they pause the rollout while they investigate and resolve the issue. And they quickly discover that they unexpectedly introduced a problem on the page where the onboarding flow was initiated. And that page actually is owned by another team. So without Split giving them this information, it probably would have been a lot of time and effort before they realized that they even introduced a problem or tracked it back to this feature being the cause of the problem. So equipped with this insight, Christina and her team were able to resolve the issue that day and resume rolling the new onboarding flow out to the rest of the customer base. So that they were really relieved that instant feature impact detection was able to help them quickly catch and resolve the issue before it became that broader problem. So that's all we have for today. Now we're going to switch over to the Q&A.
All right, great. Really interesting presentation so far, and we do have a few questions here from the audience. So let's get into those. The first one here, they're asking, do you use progressive rollouts for every feature you launch, or do you have decision criteria on when to use them? And how about for smaller things like bug fixes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And definitely from our standpoint at Harness, everything we do is a progressive rollout within our team. And we might do that at different scales. So some progressive rollouts, we might have more progressive stages than others. So for example, for a small bug fix, maybe we'll start off rolling it out to an internal group of users and then go straight to 50%, review the metrics from there, and then decide if it's ready to go to 100%. For some of the bigger features, we'll probably have a few more stages in between. So maybe go from like a 10%, 20% to 50% and beyond, just to make sure that we have more checkpoints to really measure impact and understand how that new feature or bug fix is impacting things. So definitely now everything we do goes through that progressive rollout in different forms. I think it's actually very scary to think about going back to on-off toggles today, as Evie kind of mentioned all of the challenges and downsides with that. And one of the engineering leaders that we work with actually calls them YOLO rollouts, just because that's really what it feels like now. But initially, that's not where we started, right? It took us a while to transition over to that. And I think there was a time where we were doing a lot of on-off rollouts, or certainly in previous roles. So it definitely takes time to get there, and it's okay to start small, get that practice in place. But I think once you start seeing the benefits of why progressive rollouts can kind of save you a lot of pain in even the medium to long term, it really is hard to go back from there. So again, we do them for pretty much everything in different forms at this point.
Yeah. And I would also add, like, sometimes it might feel kind of silly to do a progressive rollout for what you think is like a really small bug fix or something like that. But it's, to kind of what Annie was saying, a great way of actually putting that practice in place, of getting used to it, of building that muscle in your team. Um, and it definitely saves you sometimes, just kind of out of the blue, because we all know sometimes things just happen. So even if it feels silly, it's really about a mindset change of thinking about how you're releasing. And bug fixes and small things are a great way to build that mindset. And then when you actually get to do something big, then it's much easier and it feels much more comfortable.
Okay, great. Got another question here. Somebody's following up on knowing what to measure. So their question is, are teams often pushed to understand cost in addition to benefit, but cost can be difficult to quantify? Do you have any tips for measuring the cost of developing or releasing a new feature?
This is actually a really timely question for us right now, because Evie and I are actually working with a team on a data infrastructure migration project where cost is very much top of mind. And there's certainly some cases where cost is a little bit more straightforward. So if you think about those metrics, you may be tracking, the average order value of your customers. And obviously those types of things are very directly tied to cost. I think the question here is maybe speaking to a more indirect, where cost is not necessarily the primary thing you're looking at, but maybe something you want to protect against, and you want to reap the benefits of something, but as long as it's not too expensive to your organization. And I think the number one tip that I would share here is really spend the time to break down the cost factors, almost like build out a tree of like, this is the cost metric that you want to measure, and here are all of the things that go into that, because understanding those factors is ultimately what's going to help you focus and measure any targeted efforts that you put in place. So thinking about the current project that we're working on, one of the primary factors that goes into cost is the amount of data. And there are a few factors that even go into that, right? So we have this tree of basically inputs and outputs. And by breaking that down, we can then measure the specific inputs and say, we have this tactic or this project that's really focused on this like node within the tree, and then this other tactic or project that's focused on this node. And it's very clear how all of that trickles back up to the overall cost. And it makes it a lot easier to measure, because it helps with explainability. It takes away some of that black box that I think can make it really challenging for other teams in the organization to really understand what goes into cost. So I think that would be my number one recommendation, is again, spending the time to break that metric down. It's going to be a little bit of time you have to invest now, but it's going to make things so much easier throughout the life cycle of this project, any other project you do, and have longer term benefits.
Okay, excellent. Another question here. They're wondering, what advice do you have for engineering leaders that are struggling to get buy-in from their organizations on the importance of feature level observability?
Yeah, and what I'll say is, this is one of those things where once you experience it, it's really hard to imagine going back to how things were before. It's like you might not necessarily think you need it up front, but once you're able to showcase or experience how this prevented, one war room, one escalation, one feature that had more costs than it did benefit, and you can actually quantify those things, it just makes it so easy to demonstrate buy-in. And I mean, we've seen many cases where the work almost does itself. Once you have the impact, you take the screenshot and send it off. You don't even have to work to secure that buy-in. It's just very apparent. And that's what I think a lot of like our customers, for example, experience, is the data really speaks for itself. I think if you're interested in evaluating Split FME by Harness, I will say we do have a free offering and we also offer free trials. So it's really a safe way for you to get started, demonstrate those examples, and then secure that buy-in without necessarily, going through a big official POC or trying to make the case for funding beforehand. It's really, again, more of like a safe, low risk way to try things out.
Okay, super. We've got a lot of best practices questions they're rolling in, and that's great. I love those kind of questions. Is there a best practice for which tiers to use for progressive rollouts? What should we start with, and should we increment by 5% or 10%?
Yeah, this one I would say really depends on your organization and maybe how many users or customers that you have, because 5% at a very large B2C company is probably a little bit different than 5% at a much smaller B2B company. So I would say definitely some factors to consider there. And I would say the second thing to think about is risk tolerance from an organization standpoint. Some are fine with bigger jumps, and certainly if you're going that on-off or big bang approach today, you probably are in the bucket where you're a little bit more comfortable with bigger jumps. Whereas others are maybe more risk averse and like to increment maybe 5% at a time. And generally, we advise to our customers a minimum of a few tiers where the first, there's some level of a targeted rollout. So think like you have a group of internal testers, or you have a group of external beta testers that you want to start with, and you know that they're going to be a little bit more receptive to change and maybe share feedback with you if something goes wrong. Generally advise that that's kind of the starting point that you work with. Then from there, advise, a lower percentage. So somewhere between 5 to 20% is probably good. Again, depending on your sample size, 20% could be quite a bit of your user base. So something in there to really see those metrics starting to flow in, and if you're noticing any impact, even right off the bat. And then we always advise that at some point you get to 50%. So let's say 50% are seeing the new feature, 50% are seeing the old, or some kind of even distribution, I would say, depending on how many versions you're testing, because this is generally where you'll get the best data when you roughly have equal sample size across those groups. So always advise that as a point you want to get to. And then from there, if you feel like you need one or more stages before you get to 100%, that's generally up to you and the organization. But there are many teams that are comfortable just going straight from 50% to 100% once they have the data that they're looking for. Again, highly dependent on your risk tolerance, your situation, and honestly may even differ based on the feature you're rolling out. As we mentioned in the earlier question, there may be very small, low risk features where you're happy just going straight from 50 to 100% once you do an initial metrics check, whereas there may be some bigger, higher risk features, maybe they impact the bottom line, where you want to slow things down a little bit and just have more data and validation before you proceed and potentially cost your company more money.
Yeah. And this is also where we'll kind of say with what we were saying before, like it's actually really great to build in this kind of muscle before you get to your big releases, right? Like it gives you the chance to kind of figure out that kind of risk tolerance. It gives you a chance to really get your stakeholders comfortable with the idea and to start to see what kind of metrics you'll get to look at. And it just provides a lot more comfort into knowing before you hit this like giant release, like what is the stages that you're comfortable with? What does that actually mean for your customer base? And have some of those chances to try it
out. All right, excellent. Another question here that they're asking, or saying, I love the idea of automated alerting, but for some metrics, I need more configurability. It's okay if it changes 1 or 2%, but I want to be alerted if it changes by 5% or more. Does Harness support that?
Yes, we do offer configurable metric alert policies, basically. So in that like happy path that I walked through earlier, that was all about making it super easy to set up. We've tried to automate as much as possible to get you started and make it really easy to see the protection that instant feature impact detection can provide for you in your rollouts. But once you kind of get to that value moment, then there's a lot of configurability that we provide in the product as well. And so in addition to the automated alerting path, we also provide configurable metric alert policies where for any metric that you have set up in the product, you can actually specify a degradation threshold that you care about. So you could say, if that 5% is what you care about, you can say this metric's degradation threshold is 5%, and we'll actually watch for that threshold to be violated for every rollout before we fire you an alert. So that's where we're trying to provide you the best of both worlds on that spectrum between, speed and just get me started, but then kind of as much configurability as makes sense for you and your organization.
Okay, excellent. Well, we've had you guys in the hot seat here for quite a while. This has been great. But Evie, if somebody wants to get started with Harness or find out more, do you have any recommendations for them?
Yeah, definitely. Like Annie said, we do have a free developer account. And so this is a great way to kind of try things out with what you already have going, very low kind of barrier to entry on this. So if folks see kind of the QR code on the screen there, more than welcome to try it and then reach out. You can also, of course, find Annie or I, send us the questions, anything follow-ups, things like that. But we'll be really excited to have folks test it.
All right. Well, Evie and Annie, thank you both so much for this has just been a really informative presentation, and appreciate all these insights in the Q&A as well. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And we do have one more piece of business, and that is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of that $250 Amazon gift card today is Chauncey Bjork from Arizona. So congratulations to Chauncey. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Harness again for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That's going to conclude today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.